Today we're in Wales and you've got free for the price of one. We're at the Free Castle walk. I'm afraid we didn't walk. But it would be a lovely walk through hidden valleys, narrow tracks, bridle ways, and lovely little market towns, villages and hamlets. Between three castles, all built and owned by the same man. We're going to start at White Castle, then we're going to go to Skenfrith, which isn't technically a castle, and we're going to end at Grosmont. We're skipping the 19-mile walk, lovely as I'm sure it is. And here, White Castle was Lord Edward, that's King Edward I later on, who took possession of these castles in 1254 and used them to suppress and control the Welsh borderlands, the marshes. White Castle was built by the Normans in the wake of their invasion of England in 1066. They wanted to protect the route from Wales to Hereford. It was probably commissioned by William Fitzosborne, the Earl of Hereford, and it was originally just three large earthworks with timber defences, so timber fences and a timber fort in the middle. He led a fairly uneventful life at first, but then in 1135 there was a major Welsh revolt, and King Stephen decided to consolidate the defences to ensure that the Welsh stayed in their place the way the English had already been crushed by the Normans. So he brought together White Castle with Grosmont and Skenfrith and formed a lordship that he called the Free Castles, which for several centuries allowed the Normans to control this part of Wales, because it was the main path in and out. In 1201, King John gave the Free Castles to Hubert de Burgh, and over the next few decades it was owned by the Crown and Hubert, or the rival family to Hubert, the Braosi family. During this time it was substantially rebuilt. Gone were the earthworks and wooden fences, palisades. In was the very substantial stone curtain wall, the mural towers on the corners there, the gatehouse with a bridge over to it, and then the stone keep in the centre with a drawbridge to that. So a very strong defensible position, really put the Normans in an unassailable position in Monmouthshire. 1267, it was granted to Edmund, the Earl of Lancaster. Edmund Crouchback, it was called. He was part of the Plantagenet dynasty. And for nearly 600 years, it actually stayed with the Earldom of Lancaster and later the Duchy of Lancaster. Duchy of Lancaster is a sovereign estate. The estate has its origin from the medieval Dukes of Lancaster, but when Henry Bolingbroke became Henry IV, it was decided that the Duchy of Lancaster would become an inherited position for the king. So it's a royal estate and the king is always the Duchy of Lancaster, and it's actually run by a government minister. It sits in a slightly different position to the Crown estate. It belongs to the king, but it's a separate set of assets to the general Crown estate. And right now it contains 18,000 hectares, that's 45,500 acres of land holdings. That's rural estates, farmland, urban developments, historic buildings, commercial property, right the way across England, and the Savoy estate in central London. So It's worth about 652.8 million and brings in 24 million a year for the king. Now, although it's called White Castle, its original name, and it's Welsh, I'm sure I'm going to murder this, was Llantilio Castle. It sits on a hilltop over the Moat Valley. It's a really beautiful spot. Very defensible site. Having made your way through a 4-floor gatehouse, you come into a large open space, and there's still the mural wall. There's still another drawbridge to cross, portcullis, and then you have to get into another fort, the actual keep itself. So very well defined, quite compact, but still a very strong castle. And unusual for being so empty. Really, you go to a castle like Berkhamsted, which is of comparable size, and it's fairly crowded. There's always dog walkers, people throwing frisbees, kids playing ball. Whereas here, it really is completely deserted on a day in the week. There's a little shop on the way in, but it was closed, and I was told by someone at one of the other Cadw sites that it's permanently closed because they just don't get enough visitors to justify it. It's a shame. If you look at the window here, well, it's not really window, it's the slits for the archers. It's quite unusual shape. Normally the arrow slits are more a cross shape, whereas you can see the cross beams on the cross are offset from each other, allowing for greater volume of fire. And there's not too much left to see, but you can get inside the towers. The towers are long gone, but you get a very good feel for how it must have looked, especially if you imagine it covered in white plaster, standing out from the greenery of the Welsh countryside. It must have been quite an intimidating sight. You have to remember that on top of these stone walls would have been wooden walkways covered against the rain and with shutter windows that could be dropped so you couldn't see what was happening up there. So it would have been quite a striking sight, and it's still quite easy to imagine just how beautiful it must have been. Think of Castell Coch, if you've seen the video on that. It was the same kind of layout of plastered walls, and above where it's red at Castell Coch, the wooden walkways around the top of the walls. And you can still see the well and some of the rooms and buildings that were inside this keep. Quite substantial. It's pretty cold though, and there's a bit of a lack of fireplaces. There isn't the obvious fireplace and hall that you would normally get in a structure where a king or a lord was in residence. Perhaps those buildings are gone, probably over here. But it's quite chilly in Wales, just as it is in England. On a winter's day, you'd want a decent fire going. Now, there is actually a platform on top of this tower at the front of the keep, but unfortunately it's sealed off, which is probably a good idea since there's no one actually here from Cadw. But it's a shame. It would be a lovely view over the valley, and you'd get a real feeling of the lay of the land. Because castles are always about commanding land. They're about either preventing people getting in, but more often they're about commanding a road, a valley, a river, making sure that you know what's going on and that you can be plainly seen, that the locals aren't going to get any silly ideas. Now we're heading out of White Castle and we're going to the second castle, Skenfrith, which I would argue isn't really a castle. It's a trading post, or think of it as a workshop on the river, a docks. So it's right next to the river with a mill, but because the walls were pretty high, they needed a viewpoint, so a tower was built in the middle so that they could see the surrounding land and anyone approaching, which hints that Wales wasn't as peaceful as the Normans might have liked. Skenfrith is right by the river, and it started off as effectively a box around an area of land with walls and some low towers. But because it's by the river, it's less a castle or a manor. It was more the port, so he could take things in and out of his land. And it's striking, it's big, it's quite substantial, not hugely tall, but more than enough to deal with any marauders. And you can actually walk around it in a few minutes. It's right next to a little village. There's a church next door and a few houses, really a hamlet. And then you're straight into steep rolling hills with sheep. And it's very quiet. You can hear the birds and you can hear the water. Not quite babbling past. It runs quite fast for a fairly shallow river with some gentle rapids. Here we're on the side leading towards the river. And you can see not many places, not many arrow slits, not many holes for firing out of. It's a purely defensive wall. Now I'm right by the river. If I turn around, you'll be able to see the water babbling past. It's a very calm, restful place. Probably one of my favourite castles on this trip, even though if it's not specifically a castle. Just because it's in such a beautiful spot. For so many centuries, it still feels a very defensible position. And you can see where it meets the river. You can even see some staining where the river rises when it floods a little. It's just down here. There would have been a dock here. They could unload boats, tie them up, easily command traffic on the river. It's not very deep though. It's surprisingly shallow. You can see the rapids there. There's two sets, one either side. And it's only really a foot deep at that point. So imagine there must have been a deeper channel at one point. And here at the back is small steps leading down to a short arch that you could get through to the boats and the dock. And at the end here, later on, long after this castle fell out of use, and I say castle loosely, because really it's a fortified warehouse almost. You can see the building at the end there is probably 18th century. And hidden amongst the structure, you can see here a race. This would have been where the water came through, where it was diverted. And it went through this wheel. And although the wheel's in a very bad state of repair, it's probably a couple of 100 years old, it's still very obvious that this is a mill race. And here's the structure of the mill wheel, which I thought was really lovely. from a time before steam and diesel and petrol and batteries. But sadly, in a good enough state to understand exactly what it is, but in a state of disrepair that you can't really do anything with the building. And back round near the car park and the village, if I can call it that, there's steps up where the original gatehouse was. And in the middle you can see the tower. Now the tower, you can tell straight away, this isn't a keep, this isn't a defensible position, it isn't a house where basically the lord would live overlooking the rest of the castle when he was in residence. It is just a tower. And it was built much later because it wasn't really easy to see people coming over the surrounding hills. And again, that tells you it wasn't really a castle in the traditional sense. We're going to enter from the wharf side where the quay would have been that they drew up the boats, up these steps that workmen would have carried bags of produce into the centre of the structure. I hesitate to call it a castle, although Skenfrith is called a castle in all the Cadw documents. Really, it's not a castle in the normal sense. It's a fortified position with a very tall watchtower in the middle. Now, the land slopes off very heavily here, which gives a bit of an impression that there was a mound and on top of that the tower, but this is misleading. The floor was actually flat, and it would have been pretty even across the whole of this courtyard, but it was modified heavily when there was an archaeological dig. They carried out a dig and they moved all of the land, all of the soil, and then they threw it back. They kind of left it in higgledy-piggledy in with a big slope. So it gives the wrong impression, whereas really this was the trading post of this little, I don't want to call it empire, this outpost of the Normans. This is where they brought in the produce, the wealth, the resources of Wales. And the other two castles were for residence and for defence. But it's a beautiful little spot. In many ways my favourite of the three, and I'm really glad I came to Skenfrith. Here you can actually see into the towers. But you can't get into any of the towers. There's no structure inside. And really you can't even see how they got into them. One imagines a spiral staircase with a floor at the top. Here are the remains of some of the buildings within. There's some warehousing, some storage. There's a cellar at the bottom of the staircase ahead of us. And really very much a working castle, not a defensive castle. All three of these castles are actually free of charge. But if you're wanting to visit Wales and see a whole series of castles, it's well worth looking into Cadw, that's CADW. And you can either pay individually or you can become a member. There's actually a short-term tourist membership which is well worth looking into if you're in South or North Wales for probably a week or more. Or if you've been a member of English Heritage for more than 1 year, it's free of charge and it's well worth coming to visit these. But for now, we're going to leave Skenfrith behind and we're going to head to Grosmont, the third of the three castles. Grosmont is again a third very different type of castle. It's effectively a small manor house, manorial castle, like a keep only. There's no great outer wall. There's a quite substantial ditch. and that moat is not flooded. But there was a drawbridge, and now there's a permanent bridge you can walk across, and you can walk all the way around the site. I loved this little detail on the gate, the picture of Grosmont made out of iron. You can see here, it's like a traditional Motte and Bailey castle, with only the keep in the centre left alone. Still very defensible, quite a substantial ditch or moat, but fairly small house only. And although this is on the edge of a village, there's no sign that it ever had another wall. There was some earthworks, but really a house, a manorial castle, a manor house castle, rather than the proper full-on defensive castle of White Castle or the fortified warehouse of Skenfrith. It's beautiful walking around here. Again, just like the others, nobody's about. It was quiet, a gentle breeze, birds flying. Not like most English castles where there's always the sound of people running around and playing and screaming. Centuries, this would have been the home of a series of dukes, lords, and finally the king. And it would have lain fairly empty. There would have been staff, but the king didn't spend a huge amount of time in Wales. So for probably 600 years, it was fairly empty, a royal residence without anyone in residence, sitting on top of a hill on the edge of a beautiful little village, a symbol of Norman royal power in a small corner of Wales. In a sleepy little corner. The village is small. It's all along one road up the hill. And right now there's a post office that's open half a day, a few days a week, and a town hall that looks like it's been closed for a decade. And town hall is a very grand word. You'd be lucky to park a car inside it. But it remains as a little outpost, no doubt partly fuelled by the royal presence. Though in the 1880s it moved over to the Ministry of Works, or what became the Ministry of Works, which then became English Heritage, Scottish Heritage and Cadw. At the rear of the castle, there's a lovely view. Trees get a little bit in the way, but you can see how difficult it would be to get across to the castle. So it's pretty well defended by this moat, even if there's no water in it. There would have been walls all the way up back then. Not like today where they're quite tumbled down at the back. And you can see the chimney there. Much later addition when luxuries were added, probably in the Tudor era. Elaborate chimneys are quite common on castles like Framlingham Castle, or at Raglan you can see them as well. As time passed, lords and kings wanted fancy fireplaces and elaborate chimneys for their castles. They didn't want to look like the hoi polloi. I can imagine it being pretty cold here. I'd want to have a fire in the winter. But we've spent long enough going around the outside, even if I've only shown you half of it. We're going to go into the castle itself, and imagine a defensible gate here sticking out in the moat, probably 3 or 4 floors high. with a drawbridge down to the mainland, if you like. And then having got in, there's a gatehouse here that you have to progress through. And when you've made your way through that as a visitor, you can go into the main hall on the right, or there's a small courtyard and a series of private rooms on the other side, which were built much later on. But quite a decent sized hall here. It was cut in half and split into 2 rooms at one point. But to begin with, it was probably a single hall with just a supporting wall and an arch. A very striking, although it's just bare stone now. When this was in use, it would have been plastered and decorated, and this would have been the heart of the house. Although, as you can see, no big fireplace, which would have been quite common in a castle at this time. You would expect to have a large fireplace. Quite often the hall joins on to the kitchens, and the kitchens has a large fire for cooking, which shares a chimney with the hall. But you don't really see that here. You see just a large hall, and there's some hint of there being a corridor down the side. But although it's very much ruined now, it's a beautiful, interesting little castle. Well worth a visit. I hoped you enjoyed our visit to these 3 castles. I think personally I loved White Castle, and Skenfrith was a lovely fortified outpost. And this is probably the most beautiful setting. It's such a quaint little village, which I really should have shown a bit of. And a beautiful house. It's a castle as a house. It reminds me a bit of Bodine. The castle isn't a fortification. It's a home that's been fortified to beautify it, and at the same time is functional if required. We'll be visiting quite a few other Welsh castles in the coming weeks. Castell Coch, Castell Raglan, Caerphilly and Chepstow, just to name a few. So make sure you subscribe and join us for more history. We're going to be doing quite a bit about the Normans, particularly in the run-up to October, when the Normans invaded England. Here on this wall, just one last treat, is a rather steep staircase. It's not the original staircase, it's partly original, but it leads up to the walls. And for at least a small part of the walls, you can walk along and see the view from the battlements, which is pretty impressive. And this would have been roughly the height of the original curtain wall. So now you just see people's gardens. And you can see not an insubstantial castle. Well worth a visit.